Good morning. Today is Ascension Day, so happy Ascension Day. It takes place on a Thursday, 40 days after Easter. So always Ascension Day is on a Thursday. And perhaps you, like me, find that quite often, many years, Ascension Day just slips past us without us even noticing. It's not on a Sunday, so we don't have a service for it. It's not a public holiday like Good Friday. And so it's quite likely that for many Christians, Ascension Day is one of those days that goes past unnoticed. And that Easter and Eastertide for us really goes from Palm Sunday to Good Friday to Easter Sunday and skips forward to Pentecost, which we have not this coming Sunday, but the next Sunday. But on the 40th day after Jesus' rising, we have Ascension Day. And it is actually a really important day in the church year, even though we perhaps talk about it very little. So I spent some time thinking about why is this Ascension so important? I mean, do we actually need a day to celebrate it? And should we be going to church on Ascension Day and listening to a sermon about Jesus' Ascension? Well, if you go onto the internet and you do a Google search for why is this Jesus' Ascension important, you'll find some really interesting websites and blogs where people have answered this question, giving 4 or 5 or 6 reasons why they think the Ascension is important. And their answers I found really useful and interesting, and so I enjoyed reading them, and I'm going to give links to a few of them on my blog at reflectionsofgodslove.com. But I thought that there was another reason why the Ascension was important, which is what I want to talk about today. The problem that I had a little bit with the ones that I saw in the blogs was not that they were not right or correct, but that they all really talked about what happens after the Ascension. What did Jesus do once he had ascended? And what I really would like us to think about today, and what I've been thinking about over the last few days, is what is it about the Ascension in and of itself that is important for our faith? So why did he ascend at all? Why didn't he just vaporize or just disappear? Why did he ascend to heaven in front of the disciples? So I'd like to make a little bit of an argument that we need to think about. And I wanted to go back right to the beginning of Jesus' life, which is his conception. And we call that, theologically, the Incarnation. So at the moment of conception, something quite profound and unique in human history, or unique in global history, took place, which is that there was a merging of some sort between the divine and the human. Jesus was born of Mary, but Mary did not conceive from a human. She somehow conceived from God. And so I've sometimes previously talked about or used an analogy of a kind of divine DNA integrating with human DNA. So instead of just male and female DNA, what we have is an integration of divine and human DNA. And the Orthodox Christians, those as part of the Russian and Greek and Ethiopian Orthodox churches, they theologically place the Incarnation as very central in the explanation and the story of salvation. Because they say that what happened at the Incarnation is that God changed the very fabric of human nature. God didn't just come as a man. God, in fact, inserted himself into human nature at that very fundamental level of what it means to be human, and that he actually brought about a fundamental shift in what it means to be human through the Incarnation. And I've always found that theology really interesting and helpful and thoughtful, that it is as important as Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection are, something important also happens at that moment of conception, in the Incarnation, that God changes human nature by weaving himself into it. And so human nature is no longer just human. It now has this golden thread of the divine. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that in the Ascension, the same process happens, but in an upward direction. God the Son incarnated and became a human being. Sometimes we say God-man, a kind of some hybrid of divine and human. And when he ascends back, he returns back into fellowship with the Trinity, with the Father and the Holy Spirit. So the Trinity, which had been separated out, and Jesus had been separated out of the Trinity, is now restored. But when God the Son returns through his ascension, he comes back not only as God, but also with human elements. And so in a way, what happens is that humanity and human nature is somehow brought into and integrated into the Godhead, into God himself. Gosh, now that's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? But let's look at some of the evidence quickly that would support this understanding. And the first is that I want us to understand that when Jesus ascended, when he ascended with his body. We get this both at the end of Luke's Gospel, in a very short passage, and at the beginning of Luke's Acts of the Apostles, in a much longer passage that Luke regards the ascension as very important, and in both cases, he describes a bodily ascension. In the same way, in fact, that we have a bodily resurrection. When Jesus rises from the dead, he rises with his body. The tomb is empty. He doesn't rise as a ghost or as a spirit or just as a spiritual being. He rises in a body. Now we know that this body that he comes back in is not entirely human. He's able to move through walls and he's able to appear and disappear. So clearly this is not just a normal physical body, but it is a physical body. He eats food a couple of times and he's able to say to Thomas, here, look at these holes in my hands and put your finger in them, and the same with the hole in his side. So it is important for God that Jesus rise bodily. And it is also important that he ascends bodily. The disciples watch as Jesus' body rises up into the sky and is hidden in the clouds. He doesn't just vaporize. He doesn't abandon the shell of his physical body and rise as a spirit. He takes his body with him as he ascends to the right hand of the Father. There is something important about that, because now the Son of God is both physical and spiritual, and takes the physical part of him with him as he ascends. I also want to suggest to you that something fundamental changes in the experience of God through the Incarnation and then through the Ascension. Before the Incarnation, God did not, I'm saying these words very carefully now, friends. God did not really understand from an experiential point of view what it was like to be a human being. He may have seen us and he may have felt for us and he may have seen how our lives are, but he didn't really know what they were like in himself. Because God is beyond time and space. He has no body. He is not bound by time in the way that we are. He is not bound by place in the way that we are. He does not feel physical pain and joy in the way that we do. He is somehow transcendent. He rises above that. He is spirit. He is not body. But in the Incarnation, God comes and lives as a human being among us, and he experiences all the joys and the great parts of being human, as well as all the pain and the suffering of what it means to be human. This is the first time that God has had these experiences. It's hard to imagine that did not make an impression on God. I might be a little careful to say it changed God, because there are some Christians who would find that hard to swallow. But in some ways, I think it must have changed God to experience human life. Now, when Jesus ascends and returns as God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, he takes with him all of these experiences of being human, together with a human body, a perfect, transformed human body, but nevertheless a human body. And these are woven back into the Trinity. It is no longer that God watches human beings and understands or imagines what life is like for human beings. It is now that God has woven into God's being humanity and all of the experiences of what it means to be a human being. They are integrated into the Godhead. God really knows firsthand and experientially what it is like to be human and what it's like to have a human body, with all of its beauty, but also all of its frailty, with all the pleasure and with all the pain. I think that Ascension is really important for us in our faith, because what it gives to us is an assurance that God knows what your life is like. And I'm very mindful as I speak to you this morning that there are a number of people in my life who are really suffering at the moment, and that life is hard for them, and that they might feel that God has abandoned them in some way, or that God doesn't understand in some way. And I want to say to them and to you who are listening that God really knows. He really knows. He feels it in his body, because he now has a body. And although I don't have answers for you today about why you're going through whatever it is that you're going through, I do want you to know that he is right there with you, that he has had similar experiences, and that he knows you, and that he holds and embraces you in those difficulties. We can trust and feel confident that God is present with us in every facet of human life. May God bless you and walk closely with you during this coming week in all of the experiences that you have. And may he remind you that he understands and that he knows what those experiences are like. Amen.